Hello everybody, good evening and welcome to Birkbeck and welcome to the Birkbeck Institute for the Study of Antisemitism. My name is Brendan McGeever and I'm the co-director of the Birkbeck Institute, and I'm delighted and really pleased to introduce to you and welcome our speaker this evening, Anna Hájková. Anna is Reader of Modern European Continental History at the University of Warwick, where she is the founding co-director of the Centre for Global Jewish Studies. Her first book, The Last Ghetto, An Everyday History of Theresienstadt, was published in 2020 by Oxford University Press. She is a pioneer of queer Holocaust history, and her work in this area has been awarded and recognised with the 2020 Orfeo Iris Prize. Last year, in 2025, she published the book People Without History Are Dust, which she's holding up right now, and it was published by the University of Toronto Press. People Without History Are Dust is the first monograph on queer Holocaust history. The book won the 2026 National Jewish Book Award, and it is this work that she will be talking to us about tonight. You may have noticed as you wandered in that there's a little table outside selling copies of this book. It's compulsory to buy one on the way out. It's part of your free ticket to tonight's event. And I can exclusively announce that the book is being reduced, especially for tonight, by £1. Is it £14.99? £14.99. So this is a crossover academic trade book. Academic books are not normally £14.99. So in all seriousness, this is a great buy. In this lecture, and in this book indeed, Anna explores a fundamental question. Where are the stories of queer love in the Shoah? Anna will explain why the history of same-sex desire in the Shoah, that is, queerness among Jews persecuted by the Nazis for their race, has been marginalised, and how its return to our understanding of the Holocaust can offer an inclusive history of this genocide. Based on extensive and original archival research, this lecture will offer new ways to make sense of the Holocaust, of anti-Semitism more generally, and the return of the extreme right in our current moment. So it really is with great pleasure and anticipation that we welcome Anna to BISA tonight. So Anna, welcome.
Many thanks, dear Brendan, for the kind introduction, and many thanks to Jen Davison and Noah Smith for the coordination of the talk. And I want to open with an anecdote that we owe to the doyen of lesbian history, Joan Nessel, herself a Jewish woman, Australian, and the founder of the Lesbian History Archives. When this archive was being founded on the Upper West Side of New York, it came a moment that Nessel found herself sitting with three older lesbian women sitting around her table talking about archives and whatnot. And one of them recalled that when she was a young girl in Poland, she had the chance to read the famous Well of Loneliness, and the kind of the really important book that is Justin Ben-Greenhouse, our colleague Jana Funke, has been writing about, and it's kind of the first book that celebrates lesbian love and does not seek to stigmatize it. And the woman recalled, and we have her voice thanks to Joan Nessel, and I quote, "I had the chance to read a copy of The Well of Loneliness that had been translated into Polish before I was taken into the camps. I was a young girl at the time, around 12 or 13, and one of the ways I survived in the camp was by remembering the book. I wanted to live long enough to kiss a woman." End of quote. How come it is in 1933, as you see, that Źródło Samotności, or in Polish, The Well of Loneliness, can come out? Because it's in 1932 in Poland that Poland, well over 30 years before UK, something like 20 years 28 years before Czechoslovakia, 40 years before West Germany and East Germany decriminalized homosexuality. And it is often these kind of contradictory events that queer history offers us a useful way of looking at queer history and how it offers nuances, ambivalences, contradictions, and a more surprising and delightful reading of histories that we know better. If you are interested in how it came out that Poles decriminalized homosexuality and what it actually meant for the Polish queers, I recommend you to engage with the work of Paulina Pajang or my colleague Kamel Karczewski. So what I want to do in the following is to offer a short introduction, part one, of what is queer Holocaust history. Second, flesh it out with 4 case studies of teenagers and young people, and then offer an outlook on contemporary importance of today in the age of right-wing populism, or if you so want, fascism, and end up with conclusion. Part 1, queer history of the Holocaust. What is it? Unlike my predecessors who have focused on the Nazi persecution of gay, lesbians, and trans people, scholars such as Andras Pretzel, Sam Huneke, who is, by the way, coming to London just next week, Claudia Schopman, Jeffrey Charles, and many others, I do not look at gays and lesbians persecuted for their sexuality. I look at Jews persecuted for their race who engage in same-sex desire or gender non-conformity. And therefore, this research, and Brendan, you have mentioned that I'm a classical Holocaust historian who does victim-centered history. I look at people and their experiences, their subjectivities, their inner worlds. I do not write a history from the point of view of perpetrators. I look what was important to the victims. I should at the latest also now say, not necessarily in the talk, but it can be that in the Q&A we will come up to stories of sexual abuse and sexualized violence. It can be a difficult topic, so I wanted to give the heads up. The research on Nazi persecution of queer people is, however, a really important cousin to my work. It's the giant on the shoulders of whom I'm able to stand. And at the same time, when I started with this work something like 10 or 11 years ago, I had a bit of a feeling there was the assumption that these were 2 separate worlds, as if all Jewish victims of the Holocaust were heterosexual, and as if all the lesbian and trans and gay victims were Gentile. That there is an intersection, and that this intersection is more than just a footnote, is something where I really started to think about how we think in hard categories, and again, how normative our history of the Holocaust is. Now that history tends to be normative, that is a truism. But it's something that we have not really drawn our attention to for the history of the Shoah. And with that, dear audience, you already have one of my findings from the conclusion. One of the things that I seek to do with the talk today is to drill holes into the normative black and white binary vision on the Holocaust history. An important, if not the key contribution of queer studies, was the invitation and the manual How to Question Normativity. And the Holocaust history to this day is narrated as an extremely normative monolith. The fact that we miss queer voices from the Holocaust, we owe it to quite extreme homophobia of the prisoner society. This is not my finding. Colleagues such as Kathy Gelbin, Uta Rautenbach, Inza Eschenbach have drawn our attention to that. When you look at some of the major oral history collections of Holocaust survivors and look up any of the queer keywords, in 99% of the cases, what you will find out are overwhelming statements of homophobia. People saying, often very brave people who courageously participated in the resistance or helped their fellow survivors, they will say, I experienced extreme violence. I was so afraid when I saw my mother being slaughtered. I suffered from hunger, and I was also afraid that it could happen to me. But the most disturbing thing people will stress over and over was to see fellow prisoners engage in same-sex conduct. And then they will say something like, I wondered if they're still human, or it was the most disgusting thing, or it kind of implied to me that I'm not in civilized world anymore. And this homophobia is not a continuation of the pre-war homophobia. It is, as Inza Eschenbach in her important work pointed out, it's a bit of a human reaction to the incarceration, where people, in order to come to terms with the unknown and with the fear and with the violence, start thinking very hard about gender boundaries. And they're quite conventional about it, so they mark certain terms as stigmatized.
And this is a homophobia that continues in the post-war, then influenced the first books written about the concentration camps and about the Shoah. Of course, some of the first key historians were survivors themselves, people like Herman Langbein, Otta Kraus and Erich Kulka, or Anna Pawelczynska. And even though some of them tried to introduce some of the nuance into their work, often such as in Kraus's and Kulka's classical The Death Factory about Auschwitz, and these are two very courageous Jewish resistance fighters who survived 3 or 4 years in Auschwitz, they will say, well, for homosexuals, Auschwitz was heyday because finally they could live their wet dream, they could engage in sexual abuse of boys, implying that not only homosexuals are kind of somehow enjoying Auschwitz, but that they are all pedophiles, which is of course an old homophobic narrative. This homophobia then imprinted on the expectations for all histories. And when you engage with the bigger all history collections, as I have done with some systematicness, and I think Uta Rautenberg, whose book is coming out in 2 or 3 months, also with Toronto, you will find that even if the survivors do not come up with these statements themselves, you will quite often have interviewers who often ask second generation asking them, and have you met any evil lesbians? And when you ask that question, it's very hard to say, I have not met any evil lesbians. In fact, I'm a queer woman myself. I'm not so evil. Because the social scripting, if somebody tells you something is bad, will make you silent. Only very, very strong personalities are able to push back. And Carly Snyder has written very beautifully about that. So that is a very short introduction to tell you that when you work on queer Holocaust history, such as my colleagues Helen Finch and Will Jones and Uta Rautenberg, whom I already mentioned, you really have a much harder archival work ahead of you. And I think Laura Gibbs, who is finishing her MA thesis about queer Jewish Holocaust archives in the UK, is working exactly on that. And you work in a way differently because you cannot go systematically to Kew or to the Wiener Library and say, please give me all your collections on queer Jewish desire. You have to maybe look through survivor testimonies, see if there is a name that you could identify. You have to work with oral self-deportation archives. You have to try to look at genealogical foras. In a way, if you want to ask about it, this is something we can talk in the Q&A. So when I started this work in 2015, it was, I thought really what I will be doing will be maybe one article about archaeology of loss. I will not be able to reconstruct queer voices, but I also want to give it a try. But I thought I need to give it my best shot. And for that, I need to leave the ivory tower and try to write as public-facingly as possible. And I have to say this is a gamble that paid off, as I will show you with my case of Margot Heuman. I think that is my 3rd case. Now, I need to gallop to my first case study. So 2 more points that I want to mention. Actually, only one, is why do I operate with the concept of queerness? After all, in 1942, nobody said queer, especially not the German or the Czech or the Yiddish speakers. In a way, it is an ahistorical term. But leaning on Laura Dawn and Jennifer Evans, I see queer as an umbrella category that encompasses not only how people self-identify, say, I'm a lesbian woman, but also what people do, how they desire, what happens to them. So people like Anne Frank, who I will mention today, or Dita Neumann, the girlfriend of Margot Heuman, were not gay or bisexual or lesbian themselves, but they are part of queer history. And therefore, queer is here an umbrella category that helps us understand what's happening here. So just another kind of ahead of what I will be doing, I will not be giving a talk today about how Anne Frank was actually a lesbian, but I will show you how Anne Frank is part of queer history. Now, enough of introduction, and on to Molly Applebaum, who in the following I will call Molly, even though she was born in 1930 in Krakow as Melania Weissenberg, but just not to confuse myself between her 2 names, because when she emigrated in late 40s to Canada, she changed her first name from Melania to more English-sounding Molly. Of course, she didn't know there will be a somewhat infamous person whose first name is also Melania. She's still alive, and she's a bit of my rock and roll star. She was born in 1930 to a wealthy, assimilated Polish family. In 1942, by then her mother remarried and her father has died. The family moved from Krakow, and if you're interested in the history of Krakow and Jewish children in the Krakow ghetto, I want to recommend you very urgently the beautiful book of my colleague Joanna Schliwa. And the family wants to escape the stringent persecution in Kraków and moves to nearby ghetto of Dąbrowa Tarnowska. It is in Dąbrowa Tarnowska that Molly, whom you see on the left, meets Sabina Goldman, the somewhat older secretary of the Jewish Council in Dąbrowa Tarnowska, who is 18 or 19 years old. Here you see Sabina with her sister Mania. So Sabina, I always make a joke, is the pretty one, and Mania is the somewhat less attractive one on the left. Molly is keeping a diary, and in this diary, which she keeps in Polish, and there is much to be said about the Polish of her diary, and my colleague Dorota Glowacka has been writing exactly about that. Although she's only 12 years old, Molly is able to find quite exacting words on her attraction to Sabina. And let me quote from the entry to April 1942. If only you knew, Binechka is a diminutive for Sabina, how much I love you. Oh, if only you knew, but you do not, and you shall never know, because you will never believe that such a love can exist. It is called lesbian love, that is, of a woman for another woman. I love you with all my naive, still entirely pure heart, and I'm suffering. And you're my first love. What a pity that I cannot give you telling proofs of my love. Consequently, the ones I can give must suffice. If only I could do something for you. But you do not ask anything of me, because you do not think me capable of anything. But now this, my beloved Benienka, another diminutive for Sabina, my love for you can accomplish much. Remember that you can always count on me, no matter what. This quote is amazing, and I could talk just for 45 minutes about this quote, but there is so much interesting stuff happening. As you listen to it, I want to remind you of the opening quote of Joan Russell and The Well of Loneliness. It makes us wonder if maybe Sabina, if Molly was one of the young women or girls who have read Well of Loneliness before she was deported or before her family moved to Dąbrowa Tarnowska. It's also interesting that she is aware of the lesbian identity, but she knows that Sabina, even though she's older, may not be aware of it and therefore will actually not have the epistemological knowledge to know that lesbians exist as a thing. There is also interesting that even you could say she's 12 and she's this puppy love for her older friend, she has agency and she is aware that even though her love is not being reciprocated for the reasons that the girl on whom she has a crush is older, but also because she does not know that there is something like lesbians, that does not crush her down, she just loves on. A couple of months later, Dąbrowa Tarnowska is about to be closed down. The Germans are going to implement an action. And this is the moment when Molly's mother packs up the family, finds a Polish farmer where she moves the family, and they go into hiding there. Eventually, it's only Molly and her somewhat older cousin Helena who survive in hiding. Her stepfather, her younger brother, and her mother will be slaughtered. Sabina tries to escape, is caught up by the Policja Granatowa, by the Polish Blue Police, and is killed. Throughout the hiding, and there is much to be said about the hiding and history of sexuality, but I will skip it for today, Molly keeps photographs of Sabina, and in the diary she keeps talking about Sabina as the girl most dear to her heart. And eventually, in the winter 44-45, the Red Army comes, liberates the neighborhood, and she can emerge to freedom. And in the freedom, as by now 14 or 15-year-old, she runs into Sabina's and Mania's father, who, unlike his daughters, survived. And he desperately looks for anyone who knew his girls and is asking if any pictures survived. And it's now in her diary that Molly, in her memoir, not in her diary, that Molly writes the following, and I quote, "And I was listening and taking this all in, but I did not divulge the fact that I was in possession of a few snapshots of Sabina and her sister. I can only think now that I was afraid I would be asked to give them up, and I was not prepared to take the chance. I have these photos to this day." End of quote. It may be a truism, but today we take pictures and put them in a scanner and we can share them, but you cannot do that in 1945. And this is the moment when I would like to introduce a bit of queer theory of queer kinship. Colleagues such as Kath Weston have introduced queer kinship and remind us that biological family, especially for queer people, can be also a place of violence and of oppression, of a heartbreak. And queer kinship is not only people who are relative to us by blood, but also families we choose through affection and trust and intimacy. And what happens here, and here queer kinship really helps, is that Molly decided for herself that she loved Sabina better, and therefore she has the claim to these pictures, as opposed to the father, and she kept them. And she shares her thinking behind that. And with that, I will move to my next case study, Jiří Vrba, a somewhat more ambivalent story. Vrba was one of the founding members of the Terezín Initiative, of the survivors of the Holocaust in the Czech Republic. And yet when I came across his name in 2018, I, as Brendan kindly mentioned, who was for a couple of years working at the Encyclopedia of Everything Theresienstadt, I have never heard about him. And I was really surprised. How did I come across him? I asked a colleague in the Prague Jewish Museum to go through the collection of all history interviews and give me all mentions of homosexuality. Pretty much all of them were homophobic, but one of them by a survivor who did not consent in this context to have his name mentioned, told me about his friend. Quote, "I learned lots. I was reading lots. I had excellent friends. One of them was Jiří Vrba. Today he's dead. Apart from the fact that he was a homosexual, he was also a person who read widely, he was very knowledgeable, and I learned from him much." And of course, this is all we learned from him about Vrba. I thought, okay, who is he? Started Googling, found out he was the founder or one of the founders of the Terezín Survivor Association. And I also found out, very importantly, that the Prague Jewish Museum has a convolute of his papers. My colleague, Dr. Anna Hájková, told me that they are all digitized and very kindly sent them to me. So this is also where sometimes your archival work gets quite a bit easier. And there I sat in my apartment in Tottenham and was going through these, 300 megabyte of scans. And even though Vrba's friends after his death in the early 90s actually took the pains of reaching out to all of his friends, and some of them are pretty famous, to write down a memory of how they knew him and something special that happened to them, not a single one of them mentioned anything romantic. So reading from these memories, you would not find out that he was a homosexual. There was in fact a girlfriend, Eva Komeníková, who said, yes, I went out with him in Theresienstadt, he was very attentive, he brought me flowers, well, he was a difficult guy. That could mean anything, but of course you can read it through what you find out again. I did not stop there, and I reached out to those of the people who wrote the memories who are still alive and asked them, are you willing to talk with me about Vrba? Some of them were, and from them I was able to find out the name of his partner, who I will use a pseudonym to introduce. Miroslav Spořitel. Spořitel was somewhat younger than Vrba. Vrba was born in 1924, Spořitel was born in something like 1940. And it was when I went to interview him, and by then he was already an older gentleman, but also a heartbroken man who really missed his late partner, whom he could never marry. So I cannot really say that he was his widower, and told me how Vrba, who was deported to Theresienstadt, not yet quite as an 18-year-old, who in Theresienstadt joined the illegal Communist Party, who in Theresienstadt had his first sexual experience with a woman, the Eva who I mentioned, was eventually deported in May 1944 to the family camp in Auschwitz. And it was either in Auschwitz in the men's camp or later in Blechhammer, a satellite camp of Auschwitz, that he had his first sexual experience with a man, with a Frenchman whose name we do not have, because this is what his widower, what Spořitel recalled. The Frenchman, like a lot of French people, did not speak other languages. Vrba spoke a lot of languages, but he did not speak French. They were able to come closer. They were somehow able to communicate. Eventually, they were separated. The Frenchman was sent to a different camp. As he said goodbye to Vrba, he mentioned, if you survive it, look for me in Paris, in Rue Wagram. And that's exactly what Vrba did. He was able to survive the death march to Buchenwald. He was able to survive Buchenwald. But the story goes, and here methodologically I have to take the word for his widower, or at least say this is a good story. His first trip did not go after liberation to Prague, but first to Paris, where he walked up and down. Of course, there's no Rue Wagram if you know Paris. However, there is the very long and very sizable street of Avenue de la Rame, one of those giant avenues that go from the Arc de Triomphe, with about 6 or 7 story houses. And he did not find his lover. But he came back to Prague, to his sister who came back from England, where she survived on Kindertransporter, and to his brother who also survived Buchenwald, and told him that he is a homosexual. And then whenever he had a partner, he would insist on bringing the partner to birthdays and to Christmases. This is the moment when usually my audiences say Christmases. And I have to say, Czech Jews are assimilated. We like to celebrate Christmases. What I also find so interesting is the stories that I have, not only thanks to Verba and his personal papers, but two additional perspectives. One is that, as every Czech historian who works on 20th century, I ran his name by the secret police archive, and I found out not that the secret police had a file on him, he had a file on himself because he worked closely with the secret police as an unofficial informer. In the 50s, after, as a Jew, he lost his position, not only as a Jew, but also because he was a distant cousin of Otta Schlink, one of the people who went to Spain and survived in England and was hung and executed during the Slansky trials. Verba was not executed, but he lost his job and was sent to my work in Kladno. And it is in this time when, as a believing communist who is heartbroken to lose his influence, but also as a man who really clings to power and doesn't want to lose it, he goes to secret police and volunteers to inform on his friends. And he continues informing for the next 30 years, or until 1989. It is also that in 1993, when he has been traveling, representing the Survivor Association, representing Czech musicians traveling around the world, that even though he's only 71 years old, he suffered a heart attack and just before Christmas was delivered to the hospital. This is the moment when his boyfriend tried to visit, and Verba, who knew that he's about to pass away, tried to hold his partner's hand. Spotitel was ashamed. He was afraid that the nurses or the doctors would see him and push the hand away. Next day was Christmas Day, when we Czechs celebrate Christmas. He came to the hospital, and you know what will come. Verba was dead. And there was this old guy who was chain smoking and was already shrinking, how old people sometimes shrink when they're starting to be really old. And he was just sobbing. And I thought, this is so sad. What can I say to him? Because in a way, people look at you when you interview them and they look for some kind of closure. And I can't do that. I'm not a psychologist. I'm just a historian. And it was really, really sad. So I do not want to quite end on that sad note. I want to offer you a little bit of, if not a happy end, then a closure. I continued researching, and I was able to reach out and to interview a couple of relatives, nieces and nephews of Jiří Verba. One of them is Zuzana Lejčerová, who actually lives just where I grew up in Prague, in Davice, who really supported me, offered me lots of context about her favorite uncle, who knew that her uncle informed for the secret police, which even 35 years after 1989 is a very difficult thing to come to terms in the Czech context, and consented to showing this picture to you all. The other story that I think is quite interesting is that Spotitel did not live by himself. He had a flatmate, younger gay waiter of about my age, Jan Hrách, who also consented to be interviewed. The two were not a couple, they stressed very clearly, but they lived together to have support and to also afford to rent a little bit more easily. And it was thanks to Jan Hrách that I had actually one of the most interesting stories from the whole interview, because, you know, when you interview people, you say, and what happened next, and do you want to share something more about that? But I do not want to push them. But Jan Hrách, who eavesdropped on the whole conversation, that every so often would ask something very poignant or made a comment, made coffee, and said, you are talking so nicely, came and said, and forgive me if I'm being very flippant, said, what to me struck me as a very Czech gay question. And he said, so when they were in Auschwitz, how did they have sex? Did they get it up? And Spotitel said, well, they didn't, but they cuddled. That's all that they were able to do. And I think this is quite a heartwarming story, also from the perspectives how they're sharing it. When I next saw Hrách, Spotitel had passed away. He grew older, he grew weaker. He eventually was too sick to stay at the home where Hrách would take care of him. And he was sent to an old people's home or to a hospital with a branch of old people's home. Why it was not Spotitel's son? Because before Spotitel met Verba, he was married and he had a child, even though he already knew that he's gay and is attracted to men. Because here again, queer kinship came through, where the son was only interested in his inheritance. In fact, even before the burial of Spotitel, the son and the grandson were able to arrange to come into the apartment and pick up everything that Spotitel ever owned. And I have to say, he was not a rich man. And Harach was really, really upset and insisted that he shares the story, not necessarily because he insisted on inheriting it, but because he thought, like, why am I taking care of this man who was my good friend? And why is his family not stepping in for you? And who was born in 1928 in Bielefeld and who became the first lesbian Holocaust survivor to bear testimony. Not because she never gave testimony. Indeed, she was interviewed by the USHMM, by the Shoah Foundation, I believe, also by the Crimes Conference. But it was only when I came to her in 2018, introduced by mutual friends, that she came out to me as a lesbian survivor. When she was 15 or 16 years old, her family were deported from Bielefeld to Theresienstadt, where children lived separately from the parents. Margot, as somebody who spoke German and who was 15 or 16 years of age, was brought into one of the homes in L414, just out of curiosity. Anyone who has visited Terezin and waited for the bus on the main square? So when you wait for the bus and you basically look towards the direction of Prague, the large house that you're looking at is the children's home where Margot was accommodated. And then she met the great love of her life, Dita Neumann. Dita Neumann has the white collar. Margot is sitting next to her in the big blouse. So this is in 1956, about 12 years after the events I'm describing. They became not only very close friends, they also became lovers. At night, one of them would leave a bunk bed and go to sleep with the other's friend, and they became intimate at night. And yet they never talked about it during the day. Eventually, it's the same waves of transport that Verba was sent to Auschwitz to the family camp. Margot and her family were sent also. The whole 3 days in the cattle car, Margot cried, not because she was sent into the unknown, but because she was separated from Dita. Soon, Dita was sent with the last transport, EB, I think on 17th of May 1944, also to the family camp. And Margot told me, and I was happy. And I was really flabbergasted. I think by now you have picked it. I'm not the world's best oral history interviewer. And she said, yes, I was happy because Dita was with me and it was all that mattered to me. Then, a couple of weeks later, in early July 44, the Nazis decided to close the family camp. Now, family camp, similarly to the gypsy family camp, men, women, elderly children were together. They didn't have to undergo selection. But when the family camp B2B was about to be closed, everybody had to pass the selection, and the people who were fit for labor would be sent to satellite camps to forced labor. Everyone else would be murdered. After a couple of weeks in Auschwitz, the people in the Theresienstadt family camp knew that what it means not to pass the selection. And Margot's family said, we are not going to even give it a shot. Your sister is too young, she's 12 or 13, we are not going to make it, and we will go together as a family unit. And yet, Dita said, I will try it. I think we are going to be sent somewhere else. It will be better. Everything is better than Auschwitz. And this is the first moment that Margot said to her family, no, I will not die here with you. I will follow Dita. She told me back then the only thing that I could think about was Dita. Back then, when she was telling me the story in 2018, she cried because this was the moment when she basically said farewell to her parents. Her mother could not understand. And Margot walked away. It also saved her life because really her father was murdered. Eventually, I found out that the mother and the sister must have passed the selection because they perished in Stutthof in forced labor and not in Hamburg. Dita, Margot, and other 600 women were sent to 3 satellite camps of Neuengamme in Hamburg, where they had to do forced labor. They were starving, they were often very, very cold, they had to get up quite early. But because they were young and because Margot was never a big eater and because she was in love, she still remembers the camps as a place of kind of hope and good mood, and she was with Dita together. It was the only thing that mattered to her. Interestingly, this is also the moment for the first time, she, who always knew that she's attracted to women and thought about it, heard for the first time the word lesbian, because one of the guards was somebody with short hair, with a butch haircut, who forced a young Jewish woman into a relationship. And the prisoners gossiped about this prisoner, whom they nicknamed Bube, whose name was Anneliese Coleman, and said, she is a lesbian. This is the moment when Margot Heuman realized she too is a lesbian, but this is not a good thing to be associated with. Eventually, in early April 45, the SS cleared the camps. Men were sent to Cap Arcona on the boats that were eventually bombed by the British Air Force, and the women were sent to Bergen-Belsen to be basically killed by the conditions. Dunstone has written about it very, very concisely. And Margot did not die, but she got very, very ill with typhus, and she very nearly died. So when she was liberated by the British and Canadian forces on the 15th of April 1945, it took her weeks until she recovered to be able to walk again. By then she was separated from Dita because Dita was better off, and she stayed in the DP camps that Belsen became, and Margot was lifted and brought to Sweden to recover. Eventually she made her way from Sweden to New York. She became part of the lesbian subculture of Greenwich Village. She fell in love with the copy editor of New Yorker, Lou Burke, lived with her. And yet in early 50s, she felt she owed it to her family to have children. So she got married. She was never particularly happy, but she was a very happy and enthusiastic mother. And then in the 1970s, when her marriage fell apart, even this the moment when she started living with women again, she did not come out to her family. She only came out in 2017, I think, when she moved to Arizona because the winters in New York were too cold for her. And she told them, I'm a lesbian. And nobody was surprised. They knew it all along. They said, of course you are. That's wonderful. You can now live on your own terms. So you see, I came in the right moment. She was ready to tell the story. But you remember what I was telling you earlier about the methodology of oral histories? What was really important for Margot to trust me with her story is that she had in front of her an out lesbian woman. And in our conversations, every so often she would say, and how did you come out? And how did you meet your wife? And who does the dishes? And how did you realize you're attracted to women? Because in a way, heterosexual people don't think about it so often, but you have a biography in which your sexuality dictates in some ways the markers who makes you a little bit different, but also a little bit more human. And by reminding herself that her story is wanted and needed and important, Margot also helped herself to create a framework in which she could feel safe. I was able to hang out with her a few more times. The pandemic put a wrinkle in all of that. She was growing older and she was growing sicker. I saw her one more month before she passed away in May 2022. She was still quite mischievous. And she would do, just to give you a sense what the person she was, when my first book about Theresienstadt came out, and she who of course was imprisoned in Theresienstadt, she bought the book, she read the book, she liked the book, she wrote about it very generously on her social media. But you know, when you do a book talk and you announce it on your social media, she wrote under one such announcement of my many book talks, Brendan and I talked about my tendency to be very hands-on about book events. She wrote, I was in Theresienstadt. I don't have to come anymore. I've been there. I've done it. And as a lifelong liberal and anti-Trumpist, she would have been very happy that there was an obituary for her in her beloved New York Times, also in the Times of London. And my last case study is perhaps of the last of the best-known Holocaust victim, namely Anne Frank. So much about Anne Frank has been researched. The exact months when she passed away, whether it was March 1945 or February 1945, or the chestnut in the house of hiding, which gave her so much hope. And then when the chestnut tree died, I think in 2012, the saplings were planted all over the global world, and the various branches of Anne Frank Trust engaged with the chestnuts. And yet, when so much has been researched about Anne Frank, the queer traces in her are mostly ignored. Now, queer traces, how does it look like? I guess the best known is the entry from her diary on 1944, 6 January. And let me read out loud. Once I was spending the night at Jacqueline van Maasen's, I could no longer restrain my curiosity about her body, which she had always kept hidden from me and which I had never seen. I asked her whether, as a proof of our friendship, we could touch each other's breasts. Jacques refused. I also had a terrible desire to kiss her, which I did. Every time I see a female nude, such as the Venus in my art history book by Springer, I go into ecstasy. Sometimes I find me so exquisite that I have to struggle to hold back my tears. If only I had a girlfriend. End of quote. This entry comes up every so often in the queer media, very rarely in the many mainstream publications about Anne Frank, but this is not the only one. Cheryl Hahn, who wrote the beautiful MA thesis about queerness and Anne Frank in Dalhousie, points out in June 42, just before the Frank family goes into hiding, Anne Frank, who enjoyed flirting with boys, says she does enjoy the attention of the boys, but she wants the attention, nothing more. Quote, "As soon as a boy asks if he can bicycle home with me, I can be sure he will become enamored on the spot. Of course, there are those who blow you kisses or try to take hold of your arm, but they are definitely knocking on the wrong door." End of quote. How come we don't know it any better? This is Anne Frank, this is the icon. This is missing in the Anne Frank House exhibition, which is wonderful and focuses on so many things of Anne Frank, but not on her queerness, or any other of the many, many memorable works that deal with Anne Frank that are often really, really cool. It's also missing in the ongoing and very highly funded project on intellectual biography of Anne Frank by Raphael Gross at Martin van Gelderen. To be fair, new research engages with the issue. Thomas Spaa, in his biography of Anne Frank, looks into it. Ruth Flankin, in her biography of Anne Frank, looks into that. But as much as I liked her take on Anne Frank, I was a bit critical that she basically fails with the notion of operating with hard homosexuality. She asks herself, was Anne Frank a bisexual? Was she a lesbian? And then she says, okay, she doesn't hit the bar of being a lesbian. If she had operated with queerness as something that people engage in, as opposed to looking for proof that somebody is actually a lesbian, she would be able not to ask, was she really a lesbian, but I think asking the more appropriate question, are there queer traces in Anne Frank? Is Anne Frank part of queer history? And I think she is. The other reason why this is not better known is that it was removed from the first Dutch edition of the Anne Frank diary. We probably are, many of us, aware that not all editions in all languages of Anne Frank's diary are always the same. Anne Frank, like a lot of teenagers, was not always happy about her mother and said some very critical comments. She spoke about her menstruation, that was also removed from earlier editions. There were some bits from her diary that, of course, as she writes and as she learns about the call of Queer and Wilhelmina for diaries to document the Holocaust, she starts editing herself and removes certain passages. And this is something that she did not decide. It was in one of the versions, but that's to be published. But Otto Frank, importantly, decided to return this passage into the edition. So since then, in the English, in the US, American, and Dutch editions, 6 genders is always back. But there is the more important question, why is it there and we do not see it for what it is? After all, this is a 13-year-old who gets excited when she sees a naked female shape. This is a 13-year-old who wants to touch her best friend's breast. Cheryl Hahn, who I already referenced, has shown that women come across or are less valid as reliable witnesses. When we think about the classical voices from the Holocaust, we will think about Elie Wiesel or Primo Levi. It's a lot of noises coming from there. Something very interesting is happening. When we think about voices such as Ruth Kluge or Liana Milou, we will not reference them as the classical voices from the Holocaust, but as classical female voices. Anne Frank has the reputation of being the iconic voice from the Holocaust because she's still a girl. She doesn't classify as a woman. If she was gendered as a lesbian or as a queer voice, we would sexualize her, and with that, she would lose her epistemic credibility. And therefore, in order to see Anne Frank as important, we must render her queerness as invisible. Or do we have to? In, I think, 2018, 2019, the Anne Frank Fonds, who are the heirs in Basel, Switzerland, of Otto Frank, decided to issue a graphic novel. And I don't get any interest in this. I just recommend you, if you're looking for a nice gift for someone's birthday or bat mitzvah or Christmas, this is a really, really beautifully done, very touching and very entertainingly done graphic novel by Ari Folman and David Polonsky, who on something like 150 pages retell the diary. Nothing in the graphic novel is added, everything is condensed. I think it's condensed very, very smartly. And on 2 pages, on a couple of panels, the diary, the graphic novel, also engages with 6 January 1944. So here we see on the bottom panels two girls, one who has become pubescent and one who is not yet pubescent, and the dark-haired is of course Anne, and the blonde is Jacqueline van Maassen, saying, should we show each other's breasts as proof of our friendship? And the kind of more junior one quoted as Jacqueline van Maassen, who is clutching her teddy, that kind of represents still being a child, says, absolutely not. And Anne thinks, if only she had known my terrible desire to kiss her. And then on the next page, this is what became quite a problem, because then we see the panel that shows Anne walking through an alley of Vistorias and the female Roman statues towards someone female who stands waiting there for her. And the text says with two bubbles, I must admit, every time I see a female nude, I go into ecstasy, and if I only had a girlfriend. There is again much to comment about the picture, and I have to pay, by the way, £200 to get it printed in my book. But you can photograph it, or you can buy it as a Christmas present. There is much to be said about the picture that I think is rendered with great sensitivity, because you have a bit of a contrast between Anne, who is a teenager and who is in colors, and the female statues who are grown-ups and who are naked and who are kind of coded in these soft pastel colors. But what's important about them, we do not see them even though they are naked through male gaze. There are grown-up women who have these grown-up curves, and they own them, and they look at this young queer teenager and wish her the best. It is this picture that has woken up a great sense of discomfort in the US. Because when it came out in 2018, 2019, it was just 2 years before 2021 when the right-wing group Moms for Liberty started doing campaigns against American libraries where children under the age of 18 have access to. So they got the libraries, when they were able to be successful, to lift some books that they found inappropriate. They lifted Maus by Art Spiegelman, because in one of the panels you can see Anja Spiegelman being naked drawn. They lifted And Tango Makes Two, about two male penguins having an egg and a baby penguin together. They banned a number of other books, and they also said this is a pornographic dimension of Anne Frank, and for a long time this book would be banned in certain libraries in Texas and in Florida. There was a teacher who was fired for teaching this, and so on. And for a bit, and Andrew Lepin, on whose research for Jewish Telegraphic Agency I base here, said, in a way, it was as if the right wing said, this is not real Anne Frank, because the real diary doesn't have these woke pornographic visions. It is just a comic of the woke liberal left. And then someone looked very closely at the original and found out the original has it too. And then it was the Escambia County in Florida that banned the original library. If you are a little bit interested in the American politics and the call to come for the cultural struggles, you will know that then in August 2024, PEN America and a couple of large publishers sued Florida about the library bans that banned or gave the worried not only parents but also concerned neighbors the right to decide what will be in any library, and they were able to win in 2025. And because history goes 2 steps forward and 3 steps backward and a couple of sides in the side, it was just recently that Texas, the same state that has actually banned the library in some of its counties, put forward a required reading list for children and high schoolers, and one of the books that is on the list is actually Anne Frank's diary. With that, I'm coming to an end. These developments lead me to flesh out why is this research so relevant in our contemporary world, and when Brendan invited me, he posed me the nice challenge to say something about right-wing populism and anti-Semitism today. So in our day of right-wing populism, fascism, queer and trans people and their history as a canary in a coal mine, the current global wave of right-wing extremism and populism imagines a nexus of Jews and queer and trans propaganda. We have here a bit of a bridge technology, Klaus Lederer, a German leftist politician, has called it, where in order to sidetrack from the major issues, you have here a sideshow where the right says, let's not blame us for our economic misfortune. Let's look at the gays. Let's look at the leftists. Let's look at the feminists. Let's look at them and create a nexus that may exist, may not exist. It may be more complicated. I do not have to go through the long bow list of everything that's been happening in the US. I will just mention the bans on histories, on libraries,
on my colleagues who teach gender and queer studies in US American universities, on trans people in the army, and most tragically on trans people's IDs and councils who are no longer able to get an ID or a driving thing, and therefore they cannot drive, they cannot fly, and so on. They cease to be human. But this is not just the US. We are 30th of June. I guess it's no accident that I was invited to speak here ausgerechnet in June. And I think we have seen in a couple of councils where reform was elected either this June or the before that they stopped funding for Pride, that they removed the Pride flags from the city halls, not only Pride flags, also Ukrainian flags. And you could say, does it matter? And I hope this talk has shown it matters, because if you kind of remove the flag, you remove people from history, you lose their sense of why they value. I, however, want to be honest enough to also say there is not a flip side, but there is a different side to the story. You remember how I talked about forward, backward, and don't worry, I am almost finished, is that we have a long-standing difficulty of studies of marginalized people, also of queer studies, to take Jewish studies on board, if I may use the ableist metaphor, a bit of a blind spot, as I suggested in a forum in Jewish social studies that I edited with Karolina Krasiski. At the same time, Jewish studies have a bit of a blind spot on obsession with looking for respectability. And respectability, of course, will avoid queer history, will avoid criminals, will avoid sex work, as my colleague Mirja Fitz and others have pointed out. So we have here queer Jewish studies a little bit in the lacuna in the middle of that. I often see how Jewish communities will really struggle with engaging with some of the more challenging historical work about Jews and queerness from the Holocaust, because of course, what do you think? Sexuality and Holocaust cannot be a happy story. This is also often a story of sexual abuse, as Will Jones has been doing in their work on male sexual violence in the concentration camps. This divide in which queer studies, but also queer spaces, have been hesitant to engage with Jewish topics has only gotten worse since 7th of October. Too many circles of progressive history, bookshops, reading groups started equating Jewish history with support of Israel, which of course is anti-Semitic. According to the Jerusalem definition of anti-Semitism, I believe that a bunch of us who sit here have signed the Jerusalem or maybe even put forward the Jerusalem Declaration on Antisemitism. Not only is it anti-Semitic, I will say more selfishly, it does not help my work, and that bugs me a great deal. So how to go forward? In this age of fascism that has returned, we need more and not less solidarity. We need bridges, not trenches. We need strategy and not culture that nurtures being the most victimized. To tie to my work, we need to recognize the normativity and homophobia of Jewish Holocaust experience, and we need to see people what they are with their messiness and imperfections. I got carried away and did not share this beautiful AfD poster about queer or trans propaganda disturbing the children. And now let's move into something more beautiful. I started with the story of a teenager whose hope to be kissed by a woman kept her alive. And I want to come back to that kiss. On April 28, 1945, a film crew recorded hundreds of liberated women from the Ravensbrück concentration camp arriving to Malmö, Sweden, thanks to the operation by buses. By the largest among the arriving women were Polish women, many of whom were Jewish. Among them we see on the footage, maybe half a second, two women who had scarves to kiss. To this date, we do not know who these women were. We only know that they survived together. In this talk, I presented you with fragments of what we can establish with painstaking, long research about a handful of people whose stories we know. Why should we take note? I think we should, because telling queer histories of the Holocaust enables us to question and to deconstruct the normal. It casts uncertainty of things that we know and the categories that we use. One chance of queer history of the Holocaust is to use it as a key to open new doors for a better, more inclusive and less judgmental history. Thank you.